So we got the cylinders bored out and the pistons ready to install. We got the top and bottom surfaces of the cylinders decked. And now I'm ready to put the crank bearings in and hopefully put the cases together. I'm going to do my initial cleaning with some WD-40. WD-40 helps wash away other grease and grime. Oh no. I'm going to use some of this brake cleaner to finish cleaning it off. So I have to turn on my air compressor. The next thing I'm going to do before I forget is apply a liberal amount of oil to all of these bearings. Pump a little out, make sure that we've got nice clean stuff coming out. I'm basically going to put it in through the top, keep playing with it until I see it coming out the bottom. These rods have seen some heat in the past. I'm hoping that that was before it was rebuilt. You can see my crank has welds on the big end bearings, so I assume that the crank has been built at some time. I probably shouldn't even say what I'm using because people are going to tell me that it's ridiculous and that my engine's never going to work, but this is chainsaw bar oil, and the reason why I like using it is because it's quite tenacious. It's very thick and it hangs around, so it's not going to just sling off or run off as soon as the engine starts. It doesn't necessarily lubricate as well as some other assembly lubes and oils, but it will hang around very well. And if you put oil on a bearing and it doesn't stay on, you've got a dry bearing. We're going to get our new crank bearings, and I'll show you guys a bit of a trick for getting them on if you don't have a special tool. So what I've done here is I've taken one of the old bearings, used a cutoff disc and a grinder to cut the outside of it off, and now I have just the inner sleeve. I'm not even going to use any heat, just to show you guys. Don't really need the wood to do this, but alright, so there's a flat surface there that we're biting on. I was careful to only tighten on one web of the crank because if I tightened on two webs, I potentially could knock the crank out of true. And now we can turn the bearing on there quite easily. There we have it. One bearing pressed into place. The other side's not going to be quite as easy. Side number 2. Goes on that far by itself. when you're pushing a bearing on, there's going to be a lot of resistance, so you want to make sure that your threads are deep enough and that they're well lubricated, because if it starts to thread with difficulty, you're going to assume that it's just having a hard time pushing the bearing in, and you're going to keep going and you're going to wreck threads. So there's a tip for you. I know what you're thinking. That's kind of hokey. But guess what? It's working. And it'll only go that far, then we'll have to take it out and use some more spacers. There you have it. All I used was the flywheel bolt, a washer, an old bearing, the race off of an old bearing, 2 sockets, and our bearing is fully installed without any hammering whatsoever. For the next step, I'm going to install this PTO collar and O-rings from SBT. When I took the engine apart, these pieces were both missing. So before we install these pieces, I'm going to put a little bit of lube on the threads and the shaft. A little bit of lube inside of the new collar. Pop the O-ring on first. Then we'll take the collar, gently slide it in place. Next up, I've got my WSM complete engine gasket kit, and I'm going to put the seals in and get that all sorted out. I made this pin to retain the center seal. It's going to go in there. There now, doesn't move all around. I'm going to use a little dab of this Permatex sealant on this pin just to hold it in place. There we go. We're going to make sure we have a very clean installing implement, and I'm going to put a little bit in the bearings, and I'm also going to put a little bit of oil in there. A little bit of assembly goo, again with the burr and chain oil. So now I'm going to take my inner seal, I'm going to gob a whole bunch of grease onto it. You don't have to be tidy when you're doing this, but you do want to make sure that you don't get any dirt or grit in your grease or on your seals. These little nibs go bearing side down, wiggle around gently, put a bunch of grease on the second seal. Basically what this grease will do is stop the seals from running dry. You want to make sure that they're very well lubed before you put it together. So any place where you have double seals like this, it's extremely important to put some sort of lubricant in between the seals, and especially on the outer seal, because in order for that mixing oil to actually make it to that seal to lubricate it, it has to go in through the engine, hit the crankshaft, hit the cases, work its way through the bearing, work its way through the first seal, which it may never do, before it actually makes its way to this second seal. So this seal really very much depends on lubrication that you put in there beforehand. A little bit of oil, a little bit of grease. Whoop, actually go in the bearing, it'd be great. Now I'm ready to put on the mag side seal. It goes with these nibs in as well. Because it's a two-lip seal, if we didn't lubricate it, the outer lip would run extremely dry and burn up. Clean up some of the excess grease so that it doesn't interfere with the sealing. You don't want to get grease mixed in with our case sealant. Because I'm me, I've got a new clean razor blade. I'm going to take a little bit of grease and try to get it into the bearing. This next step is totally optional, and some people might say that it's a bad idea, like a lot of things I do. I'm actually going to clean off the outside of the bearings and seals with some brake clean. The main reason is because I'm going to use some anaerobic sealant on the outside of the bearings and outside of the seals to make sure that the bearings don't chatter and to make sure that the seals seal properly to the case. If you look closely at your cases when you take them apart, you'll probably see chatter marks where the bearings have been moving. My cases are actually pretty good, but in a lot of cases you see bad chatter marks from where the bearings have been moving as the crank flexes a little bit. It's a very good idea to take the time to run a tap through to clean up your threads, make sure that there's no old Loctite or anything jammed in there. This will save you a lot of hassle as you're putting your studs or bolts back in. If you ever watch a Permatex video on how to apply this stuff, it's a bit of a joke. They tell you that it's to be used on well-fitting flanges, and then they use like a, I don't know, like a 1/4 inch bead. You don't have to use very much of this stuff. You do want to make sure that the surface is clean. So I'm going to give it one last wipe down. This is how I apply this stuff. I make sure I have a nice clean gloved finger. Apply small amounts to my finger and then make sure I have a fairly even coating. One of the nice things about using an anaerobic sealant is that if you do use a little bit too much of it or get some on the inside of the cases like I just did there, you don't need to worry about that at all, because this stuff only hardens when it's between surfaces, when it's starved of oxygen and between metal surfaces. So the little bit that's in the corner there. I'll remove it, but that'll just get washed out basically by the oil and gas that run through it, and no harm would be done. I'm putting a very light coat of this sealant on the bearing surfaces just to try to avoid any chatter. Okay, so we have the cases glued up. I put this piece on here so that it will be easier to handle the crank. To make it easier to drop the crank in, I'm putting these bolts in the base holes, like that. Alright, let's pop this bad boy in there. There we go. Popped right in. I've got the dowel pins in. Time to pop this case on. So I ended up using a bit of Permatex gasket maker on the threads of the bolts. And I did that because I want it to come apart easy in the future, but I don't want to use anti-seize or grease on the threads because that could potentially make the case leak. My torque wrench actually has kilogram meters, so 2.5 kilogram meters. 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't like torquing bolts this small, so I'm going to go ahead and tighten them by feel, and everybody can tell me how foolish that is in the comments. One other nice thing about this sealant is that it sure does clean off nice. There we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Buttery smooth crankshaft. Time to clean up some mess and then figure out what the next step is. I know this video ran a little bit long, but I wanted to make it fairly detailed. I could have popped all this information into a 10-minute video, but I'm hoping that people enjoy it more this way. In the next video, I'm going to be building the top end of this jet ski engine, and it may end up coming back apart once I have that done, so that I can remove some material and bump up my compression ratio. Once I get it together, I'm going to have to do some testing and see what kind of squish I have, and that will determine whether or not we modify it further. I might leave it up to the viewers to decide whether or not I test it in this configuration and then bump up the compression after. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.